This meeting is being recorded.
Okay, so this week we're going to be talking about accountability and co-op culture, which is a little bit of a turn away from talking about finance and business plans. But worker co-ops are, especially worker co-ops, are really engaged in what's happening inside the organization. And let's see, okay, so maybe if you can mute, that would help. And so, yeah, so first, one of my favorite quotes by one of my mentors is that there is nothing about a cooperative that puts a halo on anybody's head. And that's just part of our human nature. Is as wonderful as we want co-ops to be, they are human-centric organizations, and so we have to create that co-op that we want, not assume that the co-op itself will simply make us act as our, create our better angels, as it were. So that's kind of why I include this part in the Academy every time, and we're going to spend another session specifically on diversity, equity, and inclusion as part of that as well, because we need to sort of unmake a lot of the lessons we've learned about management and create it in a way that is more geared towards our values and principles. And so this really talks about organizational culture, and every organization does have a culture very often, and it can be in co-ops where it is created passively, and that's not always really healthy. I really encourage co-ops to be proactive and intentional about the culture they want. It tends to be if we just allow it to happen passively, we're going to recreate a lot of things that aren't necessarily working. And so, thinking about that is, what are the co-op's core values? There's of course, the identity statement of values and principles that are, internationally adopted, but even within your own organization, how do you want to engage things, especially when there's conflict or when there's problems and maybe even business crisis, maybe a market fluctuation. So part of this is really working with the members and doing it now and thinking about it now as you're getting ready to convert, is what's important to the members. What are the common things that are bringing you together besides the specific needs around the job or the industry, and how do you want to really live the values in the workplace? A lot of this is also going to be about communication, how you're holding, what happens when there are disagreements, what happens when people don't follow through on what they're supposed to be doing. So we're going to be talking a lot about accountability and personnel management, but I think you also want to think about accountability to your customers, accountability to your community, and even accountability to the larger movement of cooperatives, and specifically worker cooperatives. So we're going to dive in, and plenty of time for questions. Ask them in the chat if you want. I'm happy to just stop and do a deeper dive into something if we need to. If we have time at the end, I have one exercise that we'll work on. Otherwise, I think there'll be a lot of things for you to take back to start working on, because I think this is a great time to be working on this, even though the priority, of course, of conversion is getting to closing and getting the purchase sale agreement written up and membership agreements written up. I think this is also a really important time to work on these issues, so that when the conversion does happen, you have this moment, kind of thinking of it as, this is kind of an inflection moment. I guess that's kind of a big phrase these days, but it's a point where you can actually stop and create the culture for the new organization going forward. Because there we go. So accountability is kind of a big word. It's kind of one of those words that people kind of know what it is and but it gets harder when you start defining it. it can be a lot of these, all of these words around here in the cloud really kind of talk to it. Sometimes in my experience, I've found in organizations that the people who are demanding accountability are often the least accountable people. And what they really want and what they're really saying is they want everybody to do things their way. And that's not really what we mean by accountability. It's about shared, it's about building resilience in the organization, or a new phrase that I learned this morning, sustainable resilience, right? That you want to build an organization that is going to be thriving, that's going to be lifting up people, and that means people, building on trust and reliability and commitment. And so, how do we do that? Some of it is going to look and feel like traditional personnel management. Some of it's going to be a little bit different. Part of that is the nature, again, of the cooperative. So this traditional structure talks about how empowerment goes from the membership to the board, to the managers, to the frontline workers, and accountability goes, generally speaking, the other way. So workers are accountable to management, management's accountable to the board, and the board is accountable to the membership. Likewise, that's the opposite direction of the power. And so this kind of two-way function then is really, I think, the way to think about all your systems. Are they doing what they want to do in the organization? Generally speaking, we break down the structure in this way in terms of staffing. There's recruitment, hiring, training, development, pay and benefits have specific issues around it. There's also employee interactions, and we'll get definitely deeper into discussion about discipline and grievance procedure. We're going to save discussing discrimination and harassment because that's kind of a special aspect within grievance and discipline because it's really regulated by the law. So we're going to save it for a couple of weeks when we have a bigger discussion about justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And then finally, regulatory compliance, so record keeping. And I think one of the things as we go through this is I'll be talking a lot about is documentation. So really, to me, a key part of accountability is having decisions that are written down, that are clear and understandable and accessible to everyone in the membership, so that everyone literally, can be on the same page, to use a phrase, and understand what's expected of them and what they should expect from others, including what they should expect from the co-op. So there's the employee life cycle, right? People come into the organization, they're attracted to work there, they get part of the recruitment process. There's the onboarding cycle as they're learning the job and learning about the co-op, development, working to retention, and eventually separation. So, everyone is at some point, whether it's through retirement or else, going to be separated from the organization. So it's thinking about the entire life cycle and thinking about what the systems you need to support workers at each point through this cycle. So first is attraction. What is going to, be a reason for the co-op for people to come to the co-op to work? I think co-ops, generally speaking, are trying to be sort of a preferred employer, right? That you want because you're a worker co-op or a worker-owned business, you want that to be out there in the community and really have a competitive advantage, right? So how do people are going to hear about your co-op as a business and an employer? What thinking about the marketing, what messaging are you putting in your ads, and who are they appealing to for hiring advertising? This is especially important. Is thinking where you're targeting the folks who you want to come work for you, and how so how does that workplace culture influence not just the day-to-day experience for the workers, but also how is it visible to the general public, to the customers, to people who are potentially looking for work. And then you can think about this, like how would different people in your organization think about the workplace culture today, and what might that mean, and how you might want to change that. And then even breaking down, sort of doing, so you could even do sort of a SWOT analysis, right? Talk about the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and even threats from the standpoint of being an employer. And really, again, thinking all through this all is why would somebody want to come work for your co-op? It might be wages and benefits. So I think it may have mentioned or probably have at one time or another at Union Cab, we used to ask people why they came to work at Union Cab, and a lot of people would say they came because it was a driving job and they wanted to be a cab driver. Eventually, we started seeing people said they were coming to work for Union Cab because it was worker owned, and they wanted to have a place where they felt supported. And at one point, there was a great quote where somebody said, "I came for the job, I stayed for the democracy." So that's, thinking about that is how are you, again, creating that attraction to the cooperative. So the recruitment process, right? Thinking about what that hiring process looks like. What do you want from people? Our references, do background checks. You can involve definitely members in recruiting, getting current members to get people that they are willing to, vouch for and trust can be a really great way of getting of recruiting people that are going to be co-op minded. One of the dangers, of course, is that recruiting through friends of current members is also potentially going to limit the pool of who you're reaching at, and if and so you might still want to make sure that that's just part of one aspect of it. But then, through that hiring process, thinking what the interview looks like and what the job offer is going to be, and working up these systems and documents, and really having a proactive measure. For the interviews, again, I think it's really best if you can create a point system, if you will, or something where there's a certain amount of quantitative process, documenting it down, writing out the procedures. This is kind of a great sort of reference of, identifying the hiring need. How are you going to do that? When do you need to hire? You don't necessarily want to overhire. Because of course, being a worker co-op, that means maybe more wages, and there's not enough work to really cover that wages. So you need to make sure that you need that position, where you're posting the opening, and then what type of interview questions, and who's going to be doing the interviewing. Is it just going to be one person? Usually I would recommend that there be a pool of, maybe 2 or 3 people that are going through the process and choosing the applicant and doing the interviews, and then you can take sort of an average of scores from an evaluation, and then basically gives it a stronger process, and helps eliminate personal biases, or at least limit the personal biases. And again, writing down the procedures, sticking to the system, making sure it's consistent all the way through, and because you really do want to minimize favoritism and discrimination. So it's great to have current members encourage their friends to come and apply, but once they're in the application process, it should be pretty much the same for everybody. And then, yeah, definitely looking at evaluating your system from time to time. Maybe checking are you hitting your turnover goals, or what's the follow through? How many people are going through or washing out in the probationary process, for instance, if you have a probationary period. And so if that's too high, maybe you need to fix something with your recruitment and start increasing the threshold of where someone gets that interview, that sort of thing. So definitely documenting the system, sticking to it, and then evaluating it. And then, yeah, this is kind of a decent sort of template for interview notes. And again, if you have group of 2 or 3 people, right? Everyone's scoring on their own, and then you kind of either average or you throw out the high and the low or something, depending how you want to do it. Really keeping good documentation in case there is a challenge at some point later, but and really focusing on what do you need for the job. So, you know, what training and education is really needed for the job. And keep in mind, of course, that you're not just hiring for a specific, job, which you are doing, so they need that, but also you're hiring for people who are going to be able to step into the responsibility of co-op membership. So like here in this example, co-op experience is part of it, but also, maybe communication skills. And there might be other either relevant work experience or even educational experience that's specific around either the job you're doing or even around cooperatives. It could be really valuable. And so, thinking again, encompassing that it's not just hiring as an employee, but as a potential worker owner, and making that part of the interview, and really getting them to think about what they're stepping into as well, and getting a sense of the expectations that the co-op's going to have as they come into the organization. Then once people are hired, figuring out what the onboarding process is. I generally kind of recommend, like a 3 to 6 month probationary period to give people time to settle in, learn the job, also learn what it means to be a member of a co-op. This might mean during this time, there's not just training for the job at hand, but also orientation to the co-op. My old co-op, Union Cab, we actually created a democracy class that people had to attend. People also had to attend a board meeting to see what a board meeting is and, demystify it for them. We did extensive on the road training too. I mean, this driving cab, but outside of that, we also really worked with people to help them understand the co-op model. So part of this might be a couple different trainings. Like you might have a training where you go through the employee manual or policy code. Then also, you can create a mentor buddy system. I think sometimes that's going to happen informally anyways, but it can be nice to make that established. If it works, if you're, have the ability and the capacity to do that. And then of course, keeping the employee records. And so during the process of probation, there should also probably be some evaluations done along the way to make sure that one, the person's able to do the job that they're hired for, but also that they're meeting the commitment to being a member, and then giving them, feedback during that of what they may or may not need to do. Some co-ops like Capital Home Care, they actually have a halfway point. So the first 3 months is basically focused on being able to do the job. And then at that point, probationary workers actually get a raise. They get $1 raise. And then the next 3 months are really focused on them becoming ready to be member worker owners of the co-op. And then at the end of their probation, there's another pay bump, and that's also when they're paying their membership fee. So they put little some incentives along the way to really make it more engaged with the workers. And then definitely long-term development. I think co-ops really are learning organizations, and so I really encourage that there's always the ability for people to learn new skills, to get trainings, definitely engaging in membership in co-op education, not just assuming that people know or get what a co-op is, helping, finding ways of engaging that. So like one of the things that Union Cab did, which I think was kind of neat, but it was, we took advantage of different opportunities. And so if we had somebody who wasn't able to work because of a workplace accident, we would, pay them to basically stay home and recuperate, but also read about cooperative management and governance models, and so that they could use that time to still get paid, and also use that time to learn more and build their skills at being a co-op member. Evaluation systems, they can be controversial. Different systems, we're going to talk a little bit about them, but making sure that there's some sort of feedback system so that people understand how they're doing. You don't want to have someone who is simply not living up to the obligations of either being a member or a worker and then springing it on them when people finally get frustrated. There should be some way of helping people figure out what training they need and building that into the system. And then, of course, finally, really figuring out how workplace democracy works and where people can engage. And sometimes it's not always easy. Obviously, the operations can become really of a priority, of course, because you need to get the job done. You need to have the revenue coming in, but there should still be some place for creating that area of human development and building the intellectual capacity of the organization. So so retention, co-ops actually tend to have much higher retention, worker co-ops, than similar companies in their economic sector. Part of this is because they have better wages and benefits as a rule, also usually better working conditions. And so that's, isn't again going to be an accident. That's something that needs to be constantly monitored, making sure that wages are in line with the market, and also, of course, within the income coming into the organization. Doing staff surveys, and there's different ways of doing those. We'll talk in a couple of weeks about social auditing, although I'm going to mention a little bit today, but a social audit is where it's kind of like a financial audit, only instead of auditing your financial books, you audit the social goals of the organization. And so, thinking about what that looks like, but this can be staff surveys, and then should certainly be part of it. Also, you can create a committee that is focused around happiness in the workplace, and making sure that there is a humane work environment that people have. And then also, of course, succession planning, and how do you essentially develop the next generation of leadership, whether that's at the board or in different levels of management. I think especially for those of you who are owners who are leading the transition to a co-op, you're already engaged in succession planning, but thinking how do you institutionalize that so that the institutional knowledge that you'll be transferring is then transferred again to the next generation as well. And so that, again, this is kind of about being a learning organization, and how co-ops are constantly in this process of improving and sharing information. So I think a key document I want to just throw in here right now are job descriptions. I know there are some co-ops that don't use them, and I can't imagine being in one that doesn't. But this is kind of the basic template for a job description. Is the job title, who that job is responsible to. It may be a committee, it may be a person, or maybe another job title, usually. Who that job is responsible for, or what that job is responsible for. Again, that might be supervising other workers, it might be a certain area or department. Also, the specific hours that are required, the pay model, what's like the main objective. And this should really tie back into the mission of the organization somehow, or at least the operational requirements. Excuse me. And then listing under the main objectives, and what are some of those other objectives. And these are different than the responsibilities and duties, right? This is, think of it as, why does this job need to exist? And maybe it's to, customer service, or something. Even you can think about what the different parts of the job, maybe it's a job that's aimed at making sure that there's food safety, for instance. That might be the main objective, is to protect the cooperative and through safety systems. And then you get into the responsibilities and duties, and you don't have to, sometimes it can be long, but it can be really valuable to actually spell out everything that job requires, and so that there's clarity and that there's openness about what the job is. And then finally, what are the qualifications for the job? Does it require, a certain amount of time and a different position in the organization? Does it require some level of education or licensing? These are all really, I think, important things to spell out. So I don't know if people have job descriptions or are there groups. I think it's something that I would say you could start working on now, is to start documenting the different jobs. And even if you have job descriptions, maybe going through them and working through and saying, is this job description still relevant to the job it's describing, or does it need to be changed? And this is something that I think, like with some of the other things I'll be suggesting today to work on, it's a great time to do it right now, before the conversion, so that if you need to make changes, you can do so, and you can set that up in either as part of the business planning or just getting ready to move forward. Are there any questions or? Okay, seeing none or hearing none. Okay, so then they're also building accountability systems. So a lot of this is about creating feedback, making sure that what is happening. So a key part of this is definitely wanting to focus in on that aspect of openness and honesty in cooperatives. Also the values of self-responsibility and self-help. And so this is about creating this culture of honest and timely feedback. So one of the things that can be difficult about evaluations, if they're done once a year, is that if you're focusing on specific incidences that happened, 9 or 10 months ago, it's probably not something that's going to be really valuable to bring up in evaluation. So thinking about what does timely feedback mean? Maybe creating systems of metrics for different jobs, having weekly data that can be shared with a work team on how well the group did, not necessarily singling people out. Definitely evaluations. 360 degree is one where everyone evaluates each other, creating a fair metric that people agree to. Again, really more thinking about what are you evaluating? Are you evaluating people being able to work together as a team? Are you evaluating individuals against their specific job description? And thinking how that works through the system. And one of the readings I put in the folder is called "The Folly of Rewarding A While Hoping for B," and it's one of the things that, as we talk about policies and creating even evaluation systems, is that we need to be always careful and mindful that what we reward is not always the behavior that we want. And in the article, the author, Stephen Keir, goes through a couple of different examples of where this kind of goes awry. So one of the examples he gives, which I found pretty interesting. So he talked about how in the U.S. military in World War II, what he talked about is that the goal of the generals in a war is to win the war, and the goal of the soldiers is to get home alive. And so he compared World War II and Vietnam. And in World War II, the only way that the soldiers were going to get home was to win the war. And so they that changed the way they approached the battle. Whereas in Vietnam, people were serving 18 months and it didn't really matter what happened. So the only way for Vietnam soldiers to get home was to survive for 18 months. And so he talks about how terms out of Vietnam, like search and evade, right? That the whole military structure kind of actually broke down in terms of discipline, because what they were rewarding was getting home alive, right? And which is good. I mean, but it's an example of kind of an extreme example of how thinking about what you're actually rewarding versus the behavior you want. And so I think in looking at your evaluation systems and accounting and accountability systems, it's always important to kind of reflect back on what is what are you really condoning in what you're doing. It's a fun read, so it's worth reading the article. Okay, so of course separation can be a couple different ways, right? I mean, part of it is, the more negative part is through discipline and termination for cause, but also people retire. People might also need leave of absence, whether through medical leave or other means. Some co-ops might even offer sabbaticals to their members to allow them to go off to pursue something else. So exit interviews are an opportunity to ask people, what they liked about the organization, where they could do improvements. It's sort of a good time to let them do an evaluation, trying to find out why people are leaving. They're not always easy because people are exiting. So, whether or not they're going to want to participate or do that is different. But also thinking about how you separate people. So for discipline and termination, usually in a worker co-op, the membership is tied to employment. And so, when someone's being terminated, they're also being asked to leave the membership. And so it's definitely something that there needs to be a certain amount of fairness and structure around, recognizing that these are, owners of the organization, so they have some ownership rights, and I think part of that means that there's usually some sort of appeal process within worker co-ops. And so that kind of brings us to some other key policies. Like two that I really think are important is one that is I'm going to call workplace practices, and the other is grievance review. I put copies of two of these policies from Union Cab just because I think they're fairly well written. But the workplace practices is really, writing. You can have this is one big policy like Union Cab did, or you can have each of these being a separate one. So what is the hiring practices? How are you going to be hiring people? What does probation look like? What are the rules around probation? How long is it? What does someone have to do? What are the specific metrics that people have to accomplish to get off probation, become a member? What does the evaluation process look like? This can be very varied, right? I think Rainbow Grocery Co-op, they actually have an evaluation committee that is its own committee, and they manage all the evaluations for everyone in the store. So, right, I think the way I learned their system was the individual being evaluated writes their self-evaluation first, and then that is actually posted in their department, and then all the coworkers write their evaluation, and so it's kind of an interesting process. And then scheduling, right? How do shifts get filled, and how do people get to full-time work? What's the process around that? Are there seasonal schedules? How are those going to be scheduled out? If they're paid breaks, following state law, of course, but also, keeping in mind you can extend state law as more of a minimum rather than a ceiling. What are the different leaves of absences that are allowed? What happens if there is a marketplace shortfall and you need to reduce the workforce? So, layoffs, that sort of thing. Co-ops don't always do layoffs, but sometimes it might be necessary depending on what is going on. Sometimes it might, as we saw with the pandemic, I mean, sometimes it might actually be beneficial for workers to be laid off, like when they were, during the pandemic, uh, laid off workers were able to get an extra allotment and unemployment. And so, I know for some co-ops, it was actually beneficial for them to lay off workers instead of trying to keep everybody employed during that time. And then, what does voluntary separation look like? Normally, in the US, workers, there's no implied contract in the workplace, so nobody is required to give 2 weeks notice, but you might also want to talk about, rehiring. Part of your hiring might be about rehiring former members, and so you might want to talk about voluntary separation and what that looks like, that in terms of keeping people in good standing, et cetera. And then finally, I think communication is pretty important too. So what are the different means of how you're going to communicate between workers? Are workers expected to, participate and be on a Slack channel, for instance, or have email that is a co-op email that they check regularly, or, be on some sort of phone tree? These are all different ways of doing things. Often, the law will tell co-ops that they have to, as long as they send a letter to the last known address of the member, they've accomplished their mission, but maybe you want something greater than that too. And so there might be others. I don't know if anyone can put in the chat if you can think of other workplace practices. Some might be unique to your particular sector, economic sector. So, for instance, home care workers might need to, there might be something about continuing education credits and making sure that they're, licensed at an appropriate level or something like that. So you might think about what are some other workplace practices. On the other side is grievance and review. And so, I think, again, a good example in the folder, in the shared folder, but, really listing out the prohibited behaviors. What are the actual things that people can do that are not allowed? For, it might be, attendance. What does tardiness mean? Is there a difference between being 5 minutes late and being an hour late? What are some of the other prohibited things? Whether it might be things that are relatively minor, but are also, maybe governed by state law, like smoking in the workplace, etc. But they might be something more important, like bullying or failing to do their job appropriately or safely. So really listing them out and defining them. I'll give a good example in the next slide, I think, about bullying. What is the public sort of customer complaint process, right? How do you, I'll talk about complaints in a little bit, but how is that process handled? What are the different rights of both the customers, but also the person being complained against in the organization? And that kind of gets into the whole behavior complaint system. So who's going to be responsible for calling out prohibited behaviors? And then you might even want to have a separate accident review system. So I threw that in because, of course, in my old life as a taxi cab co-op member, accidents were definitely a real thing. But you might have a whole safety issue depending where you are. So I know Blue Heron, is a bakery. That's going to be an area where there probably are accidents occasionally, and so you might want to have that. OSHA has its own compliance issues, so you might want to think about, again, these don't necessarily have to be about assigning blame or penalties. Part of this can be about identifying areas for system review, increase maybe better training, or maybe realizing that a certain way of designing the job isn't working and it's time to redesign the whole job, or maybe the equipment. There are also some other ways of thinking about it, is creating alternative dispute resolution, which might include mediation, which again doesn't necessarily have to be aimed at trying to penalize people or assign blame, but more about trying to resolve the issue at hand and the conflict. But then I think everything, regardless of what you're doing, there should be some sort of appeals process. And I would usually recommend that that be done in a way so that the board of directors is sort of the last internal step, but the board itself tends to try to keep the board out of the main part of the review. That you really want the board to be focused on the larger issues, but if something has to come to the board, then they would be the final internal process to decide on any appeals. Okay, just checking in. Can't really see chats or anything. Any questions or thoughts? Okay, quiet crowd today. Okay, so I do want to talk about bullying because bullying is something that is probably a lot more common than people think it is. It's estimated 49% of Americans have either witnessed or experienced on-the-job bullying. And what's significant about that is that most of what constitutes bullying is perfectly legal. There's, it's as the definition here, I think is a really good one, a pattern of behavior causing emotional distress, which a reasonable person would find intimidating, offensive, degrading, or humiliating under the same circumstances. And I think the key here is that it is repeated, unwarranted, or invalid criticism. So repeated humiliation, right? It needs to really be repeated. It's not something that happens once. And also that, because often they might not be done in the presence of others, but that it constitutes bullying whether or not it's in the presence of others. So 72% of bullies tend to be in a position of power over their victims, although sometimes people can bully up, as they might call it. And there is a gender aspect to this. So men are generally bullied by men, but women tend to be bullied by both men and women. And also, much like other things such as domestic violence and such, people who witness or experience bullying are more likely to become bullies. So it's kind of learned behavior, and so it's pretty difficult, but it's also something that if it's in the workplace, I mean, a lot of this, because it's learned behavior, people may be coming into the space and bringing their own trauma and baggage. And so I think part of this is to also think about the role of co-ops and worker co-ops is that you are engaged in a lot of ways, not just in an economic enterprise, but also a human development enterprise. And so as you're trying to help workers build their intellectual capacity to manage the co-op and to meet the co-op's mission, you're also helping them, become, stronger people, the better versions of themselves. And so, thinking about how you use a system then to create a space for people to grow and also unlearn maybe behaviors that serve them at a point at some point in their lives, but don't really work in a cooperative setting anymore, is I think pretty important and one of a key role for worker co-ops. So some more policies. I think the workplace practices, I mentioned it earlier. I guess I don't know why I repeated the slide. I was putting this together, but these might be just some other areas of thinking about it. And so for grievances, grievance processes, again, should also be really written down. This is an example from what a lot of the home care co-ops do. So if, a worker at a home care co-op has a grievance, they need to, write down the grievance, clearly stating the issue, ideally even referring to the policy or law, and then the steps to resolve it. In this case, the co-ops take it to the board president, and the board actually then acknowledges it and starts the process. So again, I kind of feel like there should be a step between the board and doing this, but I guess that's my own bias. So in this case, once it's acknowledged and written, then you want to act within a relatively quick amount of time. You don't want it to be something that's just hanging out there and ignored. This can really be create a huge morale issue. Usually, the board will then invite the parties to come and also present to the board, but then eventually they'll make the decision, and this, of course, is one of the areas where I think it can be problematic. So you want the appeal, right, to always be at a higher level than the group that's making the decision, and so I think that's part of it. But usually the appeals are going to be based on that a policy wasn't followed or in the decision making, or that there was some bias or something like that. So when you think about appeals, it does get into that sort of legal framework. And I think one of the reasons why having the board be the final body is because usually the only way to appeal a board of directors decision is to go outside of the organization. And so you really want to make sure that the issue has been clearly explored and vetted, and that if it does go to a city court or human rights council, that the co-op can show that it really worked through these issues and it came to a very coherent decision. So I think sometimes just having that extra step is important. So this is one model. The other model is one that we created at UniCab. So UniCab, this is our governance chart, but we have this whole system called peer review at the bottom here, and that included a mediation council, a behavior review council, an accident review council. We also had a workers council, which heard appeals, and then a directors council that would hear appeals. And then we created this whole group of stewards, and the stewards' role was to help people navigate the process. So if you filed a grievance, you would have somebody in the co-op who was there to help you advocate on your behalf. So sort of, think of it like a lawyer, but it's, more like a union steward. And it just helps people not feel intimidated, I guess, for lack of anything else. But the process, let's see, what am I doing now? Oh yeah, so I didn't get to that part. All right, so the process, let's start with, shoot. I'm gonna have to go and come back. Okay, so the peer review system, the way we created it, and I think this is actually a good one if you're able to do it. We took discipline away from management after doing some social audits, right? Some surveys of our workers, and there was a real feeling that the disciplinary system wasn't ethical, that there was too much favoritism in how disciplines were done. And so the board worked over the course of about 1.5 years and basically took complaint or discipline out of the hands of management. So the managers no longer issued discipline, and in their place, they created this behavior review council that was made up of workers who applied and had a relatively clean record and had some training, and they were created a council, and so a complaint would be brought forward to the council. Then the council would do the investigation using sort of this European model of justice, where they do the investigation, hear both sides, and call witnesses, and then make the decision. What they also decided is that customer complaints could only be used as evidence. So it was going to require that somebody inside the co-op, a worker, brought the complaint to the behavior review council about another worker. They could use the customer complaint as evidence, but it had to be somebody bringing it forward. It couldn't just be a customer complaint out there. Usually the hearings were public unless one or both parties wanted to close session, and then really focused on progressive discipline. So the most one, if they first would be decided if there was a violation of policy. And then if there was, it would talk about whether this was an issue of training or education, or maybe even system failure, in which case the worker might not be disciplined, but there might be, a report to the board saying, this work design isn't working. And again, so progressive meaning that people, you start out with light discipline to help people move in the right direction, and you get progressively more severe up to including termination. The decision for the Behaviors Review Council could be appealed rather to the Workers' Council, which was a randomly selected group of workers. They would be drawn literally out of a hat by whenever an appeal was called, which may have happened like once or twice a year. And then they would just hear it, and they were obligated not to retry the whole thing, but to ensure that the Behavior Review Council followed policy, that they weren't acting by bias, etc. And so basically, just making sure that the process was appropriate, and that people had, workers, the accused worker, I guess, had the right to make their case, and that, bring forward any evidence or argument they wanted to. And then finally, that could also then be appealed to the board of directors as the final internal appeal. And so, it was good. I think it really worked. It was obviously, it may be a little too much for a small organization, but but there are other ways of doing it. So, again, I think Rainbow, I put Rainbow's process, Rainbow Grocery Co-op's process in the folder too, if people want to look at it. They have another one where, it's a small, where the coordinator of the department might, issue a letter, and then, or it might become a discussion by the collective at a collective meeting and put on the agenda. The idea is so for these things to be open and honest, and really focus on that aspect of being a co-op, and that, people need to be accountable to each other. And so, again, the process isn't necessarily designed to be punitive as much as it is about trying to create expectations and encourage sort of that solidarity within the organization, that you're all trying to make the system work, and that means that, fulfilling policies that people have agreed to and consented to. So I'm going to go back because I wanted to, oh shoot, I lost my space here. So I want to talk a little bit about community accountability. So I think, most of what I've been talking about is about worker accountability, which is important, and member accountability. And I think, keep in mind that, management is also workers, and so they're also going to be accountable under that system. But it's also, I think, important to talk about, the accountability of the co-op to the broader community. And so specifically talking about, complaints and customer complaints. I can go on quite a bit about this. I actually think it's definitely part of a strong marketing strategy to think about how you handle complaints. It really sits around these ethical values of cooperatives, of honesty and openness, of social responsibility, caring for others. Sometimes I think, it can be where, workers in a worker co-op can feel like, well, I've had jobs where the customer's always right, and that's not the place I want anymore. And that's fine, customers don't always know exactly how the job works. And so, but it's also important to make sure that they're heard, because, ultimately that's the customer who is funding the operations of the co-op. And so, part of that is thinking about the value of a customer complaint. And so, in my mind, as I like to say, is that it is your most loyal customers that actually complain. sometimes people are just complaining because they're angry, and that's going to happen, or or they're just assuming that your co-op is like every other business in that sector, and they are just not very trustful, don't have a lot of trust. But generally, I see customers who complain as loyal customers, that most people who have a bad experience with the business simply never come back to it. They just vanish. But customers who are loyal actually take the time to let you know about a problem that they're having with your business, that they're providing you really important feedback that something went wrong, and that this might this creates an opportunity then, and this is not just from a marketing standpoint, but it's an opportunity for the co-op to really express that cooperative difference that are based on the ethics and values of co-ops. It creates an opportunity for you to fix operations, and it might be that this is the operation is really something that needs to be fixed, and it's going to make even the staff happier too. And so really using customer complaints as a way of being able to monitor your systems is really important. And it also allows you, of course, to really align your advertising with the lived experience of your customers. And so I think, one of the things that, again, when we talk about marketing, is that advertising works to get people in the door, but it's what happens when they're in your store that keeps them coming back. And so you want to make sure that there's an alignment between the two. And this is where I think the complaint process can be really powerful. So I just put this out here, something that I used to preach quite a bit with the 4A technique, right? So acknowledge and validate your customers. And this doesn't mean that you necessarily have to accept blame, or you simply just, most people who are complaining also want to be heard, I think, is what is more important, even if it's something that you can't actually fix. They just want to sometimes just have people acknowledge that something happened and their day got really screwed up because of it. So but then the second A, assessing the situation, asking questions, getting facts, really trying to get them off the emotion part of the call and getting into, what specifically happened, and then, try to figure out alternative solutions. This can help them feel more in control and pleased again, and then assure them that the complaint that will be investigated, and explain the process that you have and when to expect a response. And then of course, making sure that follows through, right? That people do get that response and that they do get that call back. And I think, this is a great way of kind of thinking about what your complaint strategy would be, and working this through. So what we did at Union Cab is what we also took complaints away from management, which specifically was me. I was the complaint person for basically a dozen years, and we moved it to a committee. And what we did was we took all the names off of the complaint. So the committee only looked at the behavior that happened, or the alleged behavior, or the problem. And then the individual being complained about also had their name removed, but they were able to respond directly to the complaint. And then the committee would talk about it. And we had, it was a committee that was made up of a lot of frontline workers. So, people who really understood exactly what was happening in the situation, and we would make decisions. And sometimes we decided the complaint wasn't valid, and we said we just didn't do anything with it. Other times we thought it might be valid, but we can't really, there's not enough here to really say anything, so we're just going to put it aside and not do anything for now. But if there's similar complaints, then we'll look at it again. And then we would start, and then from that it would be talk to a supervisor, get some more training or other things. So it really took a while for someone to get to the point that we were going to actually make a complaint to the Behavior Review Council, right? So, and what we found when we did this is that in the first year of going to the system, complaints dropped by about 54%. So we were getting, a cab company with the phone number on the side of the cab, you can imagine, got a lot of complaints, so-and-so cut me off or was speeding. But what we found was, after about a year, instead of getting a complaint a day, we were getting 2 to 3 a week. And so we saw an actual behavior change by being able to do this rather than having one person get a stack of complaints that they can't really meaningfully work with. And so there's a way of, I think, a really good example of how the complaint process can actually be used to really improve the organization as a whole. Peer review system. So and the last thing I want to talk about, movement accountability. So, worker and solidarity co-ops are part of the labor movement, and they're also part of the co-op movements. And so, thinking about what it means to be and what's the responsibility of a co-op to that larger movement. And so, co-ops, we're still a relatively small part of the overall economy, especially worker co-ops, although there's been a huge amount of growth over the last 10 years. There's still maybe only 800 co-ops across the country. And so I think it's important for co-ops to really think of that role. And so when a worker co-op fails, what people tend to see is not that there was a management problem. They tend to say co-ops don't work. And so I think there's this kind of responsibility on the part of co-ops to really try to do their best to make sure that they're going to succeed. And how do they do that? I think, part of it is, really trying to proactively abide by legal requirements, right? Fair dealing, being sustainable and good environmental stewards. And then I think also providing, leadership for other co-ops. And so like next week, we have a couple of different people coming in for a panel who are from co-ops and gone through a conversion, and that's a great example of providing leadership. They're coming in to share their stories with us and to answer questions. There's also, joining organizations like the U.S. Federation of Worker Co-ops, where you can engage in that peer network with other co-ops and learn and also teach things about what you're doing and ways that you figured out to do it. And just also, really recognizing that although you're a standalone organization, you are part of this larger effort that is trying to, make the world a better place. So I think it's just, thinking about how you as a co-op or how we as co-ops engage in that. Okay, so let's see where we're at. Yeah, so a couple opportunities too. I want to mention CoSound, and if anyone is from CoSound or is involved with CoSound that wants to talk about it, but I mentioned U.S. Federation of Worker Co-ops, so should I talk about that? So what it is they're a national trade association. They do advocacy and peer support at national level. They've actually started doing advocacy at state level too. They have a co-op clinic, so they provide education, information, and training, right? They also have actual benefits. So through the U.S. Federation of Worker Co-ops, a worker co-op can access vision, dental, long-term disability, and in Washington, they can even access healthcare that are, affordable and actually relatively decent plans. Likewise, here locally, CoSound, South Sound Cooperatives, is a network of co-ops. It started as a committee of the Olympia Food Co-op, but now it's a trade association for the co-ops in our region. And I'm not sure how big the region South Sound is, but I'm guessing it's going to be at the very least Thurston, Mason, maybe Pierce County. Again, they're working on trying to figure out what their different services and role will be in our community, but a lot of it will be networking, probably providing peer support, and then also advocacy as well. And I don't know if anyone is Fred, if you're here, if you want to have anything else to add about CoSound or. Okay, well, there we go. then here's some resources too, and these slides are all in the folder as well, but I mentioned on the following for wording A while hoping for B, but also, it's really worth looking through the human resources. It's a term I'm not really a fan of, human resources, but definitely looking through the different models, even grabbing a textbook that can help you think about what are some of the standard practices. I would say, also think about it in terms of how can you work those practices into a co-op environment, right? So some, if some of the practices seem like they're not really going to be fitting within your culture, thinking about what you can do to change them, but it can be a great place to start. I think we have time, so let me see here. Yeah, so this is an exercise I was thinking, whoops, we could do, and I don't know why I'm having trouble with my slides today. So this is an exercise I was thinking we could do to kind of think about culture, think about what you want the co-op to be. And so for those of you who know Glassdoor, it's a website where you can basically sound off on former employers, and and you can also praise former employers too, but it's kind of a Yelp for employers. And so it's a place, to where, so thinking 10 years from now, 2032, the co-op's been up and running for a good decade. What are 3 common themes that you read regarding the culture of your cooperative on this website? Of what do current workers say and what do former workers say? And so I think I'm going to stop sharing there and thinking, yeah. So who all do we have? We have Blue Heron, I think, and Trillium. Is that all we have today? Is there anyone else? Okay. Then I think maybe we can go into 2 groups. And I will. Okay. Okay, so yeah, so let's just, I'm going to open the rooms and just take the rest of the day. So Trillium and whoever can be from Blue Heron, and we can try to answer that, answer the question. So what, 10 years from now, what are people saying about what it's like to work for your co-op?